here. I've had a wonderful day meeting with a variety of people, some of whom I've known before, and with faculty and staff at lunch. And what's most important to me is when I get a chance to come to a campus and give them my impressions about their institution and to hear what they think of themselves. And so one of the questions I asked throughout the day was, tell me your perceptions about Dartmouth. What language do you use? How would you like to be viewed, quite frankly? And so as I talk today about innovation and inclusive excellence and leadership, I want to leave a lot of time so that we can have an exchange. I begin with words from one of your former presidents, who was a dear friend and a mentor of mine, Jim Freeman. It turns out that Jim and I both worked with new college presidents for years in the Harvard program, and at one point when he retired, he recommended me to conduct his seminar on the academic role of the president. And I've been doing that for perhaps a dozen years. And I always begin those sessions, and there are always 50 to 75 new presidents in the room, with a quote from Jim. And how many of you were here when he spoke at the last commencement? His last commencement, it was in 1998. How many of you experienced? You'll appreciate. This is from that commencement address in June of 1998. He was talking about a liberal education, which he called the surest source of a satisfying life. He said, a liberal education that lasts a lifetime will inspire you to strengthen the foundation of your moral identity and to explore the ordeal of being human, the drama of confronting the darker side of the self, the responsibility of imposing meaning on your life and society, the challenge of transcending the ambiguity-entangled counsel of arrogance and modesty, egotism and altruism, emotion and reason, opportunism and loyalty, individualism and conformity. And from another talk that he gave that I continue to think about, he says in a piece on idealism and liberal education a couple years before that, there are few golden ages. There's only the timeless continuity, the halting tempo of challenge and response. I have been ever cognizant that colleges maintain their standing in society only by a persistent effort, decade upon decade, to deepen our understanding of ourselves and to explore the most distant horizons of knowledge. I find those words inspiring as I talk about innovation and inclusive excellence. What you have that I think makes you a model for educating students and for what we think about as the best of American higher education is this combination of a research environment with faculty who are publishing and bringing in the grants, with almost 200 million in grants I saw, coupled with an emphasis on students, and particularly undergraduate students. We expect research institutions to care about doctoral students, but as many of you know, very few institutions have thought through what it means to care and to really support undergraduates and to pull the undergraduates into the research. So it wasn't surprising to me as people talked, they would mention both things, the fact that you have first-rate faculty and committed staff, and that you have really talented undergraduates who get a chance to get involved in the research. Every person has a story, and now this is New England, and I am from Baltimore, which I would call the Upper South. One day we're like Philadelphia, the next day we're like Richmond. It depends on the issue, like the Civil War, all right? But I grew up, as did some of your colleagues here, in the Deep South in Alabama, where we know exactly who we are. We are Southern, and in the South, in the Deep South, we love stories. And I begin really with a story, a very brief story that speaks volumes about my own childhood. You're celebrating the 40th anniversary of some very special events in your history involving the emphasis on Native Americans, the Black Alumni Association, some really wonderful co-ed education. And I am in the process this year of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Children's March in Birmingham. And it was in this year that I was a little 12-year-old in the 9th grade and had no idea, a little fat kid loving math, loving to eat and math, those were my two loves. Had no idea that I would hear this man talking about the opportunity to go to better schools and that we'd stop using hand-me-down books if we just participated in this march to show America that we knew we deserved a better education. Had no idea I'd spend a week in jail. Had no idea that I'd get a chance to work and take little kids to jail. But the experience, it was quite an experience. I was as afraid. I was not a courageous kid. I was just a fat little kid loving math. Remember that. But I wanted to see what the white kids were getting in their schools, because we'd always been told their schools were so much better. And we knew the books we got and the things we got were tended to be already used by others. And so I was willing to do it. And what the experience taught me has really shaped my philosophy about educating young people. It taught me that even children really can think well. And if you empower them to understand their circumstances, whether they're 12 or young people at 18, quite frankly, they can do amazing things. They absolutely can. And that experience from age 12 has shaped what I think in many ways. When I think about innovation and inclusive excellence, several things come to mind. Number one, innovation has everything to do with being able to look at the situation as it is and to think about what you'd like it to be. And that means for me being able to look in the mirror at the institution, for example, my own UMBC, as we have done over the years, and to see the good, the bad, and the ugly, to see what's challenging and what's good, to appreciate the strengths, but to say, this is where we are, but this is where we want to be. And I know that you're going through this strategic planning process right now, and I've heard people say, and I've read this, that when you think about the master plan, the strategic plan, it really is about what you want to become. When you think about your culture, it really is who you are. Your culture has everything to do with the questions you ask and the ones you don't ask, those things that you really value, what you highlight, the achievements you talk about, those you may not have thought about, the values that you hold important will all be your culture. And I would argue that as we think about innovation in higher education, we have to look at the culture of every institution to appreciate what is significant there. For you, clearly, attracting and supporting first-rate faculty, doing the research, but looking at teaching and learning, working to help undergraduates become the best that they can become. When I asked a number of your alumni from around the country as I was going to be coming here, and others who just know about you, what they thought about Dartmouth, it was a very positive picture, of course. A positive one because it's a challenging place. It's a place with very high academic standards. And yet, as I've said to people today, one of the points made was that there is some indication that you have a lot of undergraduates who spend quite a bit of time having a party. And that doesn't mean they aren't serious, but the question of the balance between the intellectual side and the party side is an interesting one for you. And it's one that people are aware of. And yet people talk about the undergrad experience here, and there are those who would say, well, let undergraduates be undergraduates and just have a good time. There are others who would say it could be a more serious place for undergraduates as they think about it. And you determine whether or not, to what extent that is the case. I tell it to you because innovation involves hearing what may not be as the best at what you want it to be, because there's no way you can improve if you don't say where you are right now. And we've gone through that same experience, and many institutions would say exactly the same thing. Well, last night, and I said this to several people, and they said, you should say it. I got out of my car at the hotel, at the inn, and it was clear that there were some guys last night who had been drinking and having a good time, and they were very loud. And I just listened, and I thought to myself, this is Monday night, and not sure this is the best thing for them to be doing on a Monday night. And I did something that was really interesting. I called one of my colleagues who was on campus, and I said, go around and see if there are any kids out there drinking right now Monday night, and tell them to go to the rooms and study or something. And I tell you that because it could happen on any of our campuses, but it is symbolic of a challenge that we all have in higher education as we think about issues of drinking, as we think about what happens in the middle of the week, as we think about this relationship between the serious and the other side. And I think what makes you particularly unique is that the population is a manageable one in terms of the number of undergraduates. You do care about undergraduates in a way that liberal arts colleges do. This is one of the best things about liberal arts colleges is just that, the nurturing, the development of those undergraduates. And the other part that's significant to me is that you can pull them into the work, into the intellectual life. And I'm sure as you go through the planning, and as I talked to people today, I was very impressed by the authenticity of people across the campus in saying, yes, we are very good in many ways. You're top ranking in undergrad teaching, and yet you know success is never final.
And I'd like to talk about a part of what we've done and some of those challenges. But I want you to think about this one question. You attract some of the best prepared students in the world. You have some of the best faculty. The question is, what can you say about the graduates as they cross the stage? About their values, about their interest in helping others, about the kinds of leaders they're going to be. Because you are preparing those who will be among the most elite in our society. And I think it gives you a wonderful opportunity, but an awesome responsibility as you think about your graduates who will lead the nation in many ways. We think that same way, that we've got this responsibility not simply to give them skills, but to help them think about their view of the world, their relationship to others around the world, and particularly to people who have not had the privileges of my middle-class population, of your apparently very wealthy population. Not all, but clearly, you are some of the most privileged your students in the world. And you are fortunate to be in this setting, and I commend you. I simply say to you what I say to my colleagues. What's our responsibility? How do we think about the Dartmouth education, the UMBC education? I come from a campus that has students from 150 countries. Make no mistake about it, the students who come from other countries tend to be far more disciplined than American students. Far more disciplined, whether they're from Nigeria or Russia, China or Barbados. They're hungrier for the knowledge, and we have focus groups. One of my messages to you today as you think about innovation and looking in the mirror, and this notion of inclusive excellence, it has everything to do with how do we help students from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, not simply to graduate, not simply to survive, but to excel. To excel. How do we set the bar so high for all groups? And then for ourselves in such a way that we create or reshape the teaching and learning environment to ensure that as many students as possible will learn the right habits of mind, who will appreciate what it means to talk about an active life of the mind. We have worked for years at UMBC to say nothing is more important than intellectual pursuits, that it should be a campus where the life of the mind is very active, and quite frankly, a place where it's really cool to be smart. Smart meaning excitement about ideas. Smart meaning really excited when you're publishing in a referee journal, or about the 2 undergrad journals we have on campus, or about a serious play. I said today that to some of your colleagues that we are strong in science and engineering, but we're also strong in arts and humanities. We're just putting up, I just was in your arts facility, a wonderful facility, by the way. I was taking pictures. I always like taking pictures to show people things. But we've just really pushed to get, and we're in the process of finishing our $170 million arts and humanities building. Just building excellence in those areas too. And we do serious theater. Beckett is our muse. We are a dark campus, we really are. You go to a production, you're either depressed or you're angry. All right? You never leave theater at UMBC happy, I promise you that. Wait a minute. The students, the serious, but Beckett, we talk Beckett a lot. And across so whether it's science or theater, I mean, you got students in interesting places around the campus talking about ideas. That didn't just happen. Years ago, my students of Asian descent tended to be working in groups, and my black and white students tended to be talking about the party from the night before. And we were determined to change that, to turn that around. And one of the things we did was to help American students look at and think about how people from other parts of the world view their education. I'll never forget having a focus group, and we had students from Russia, from China, from New York, from DC, and a young woman from Jamaica. And it was very clear that the students who had spent most of their lives in other countries and came here when they were 13 or 14 or 15 or whatever, were just more serious about the work, a little more intense. And I was trying to understand why there were these differences. And one of the students from Jamaica said, I don't mean to insult my American friends, but it seems to me that middle-class Americans go to college thinking that it's grade 13. It's the next thing you do. And so for you, she looked at her friends, American friends, she said, this is just the icing on the cake. She said, but for me, if I don't excel, my younger brothers and sisters may not eat. So it's not the icing on the cake, it's the very bread of life. That's what education is. And there was this moment of goosebumps, because she literally almost brought people to tears, because it was for her so serious that she should work to be the very best. And that moment was an exciting one because it sparked great conversation about how we view education. Why is it important to go to college? Is it simply about getting a job and making money? Is it about much more than that? Is it about one's sense of moral identity? And it was fascinating that we continue to have those conversations. And one of my recommendations to places that are working on innovation is to not only have faculty and staff thinking about who you are, your culture, and what you want to become, but to have those conversations with students, undergraduate and graduate students, and to listen to the voices of those students. It's amazing how much I have learned over the years. I want you to think about, and first of all, much of what I say today can be found in the articles. If you go to my webpage, you'll see a number of articles that a research team and I have worked on for years involving our culture and what has made the difference. We decided some years ago that we could be much better than we were. That while the best students, often students who had some international background and a few others, were doing well, and everyone knew if you wanted to go to med school in my state, we were one of the places you'd come to, it was very clear that minority students, particularly underrepresented, Black and Hispanic, were not doing well. And we decided to experiment, to start a program, the Milehoff Program, with the idea that we wanted to find the best prepared students we could find in our state, be first in our state, and see if we gave them support, how well they could do. I went around the country looking for one institution, predominantly white institution, that was producing even 5 Black kids a year who could get PhDs. Could not find one in the nation. And what I found as I went to a lot of the Ivies was a lot of kids who started off in pre-med and changed to pre-law, business, or whatever. And I should tell you, my report from the National Academy of, if you look at the report on underrepresentation in science that came out in the last year, with people from Harvard and MIT all the way over to some of the Texas institutions, what we saw was that it isn't surprising that only 20% of African Americans and Hispanics who begin with a major in science or engineering will graduate in those areas. It is stunning that only 32% of whites who begin with a major in science and engineering graduate with a bachelor's in science and engineering, and only 42% of Asian Americans. Now, the first response is students aren't well prepared. Well, that is true for some, but other research showed the committee this. The higher the SATs, and the larger the number of AP credits in STEM areas, and the more selective the university, listen carefully because this is counterintuitive, and the more selective the university, the greater the probability the student, regardless of race, who begins in science will lead it within a year or two. Now, usually students will say, well, I like something else better. Well, if you get an A in something else and a C or D, of course you like it better. And if you've been valedictorian in your high school, you're not going back saying, I didn't do well in science. I said this to all of the institute directors at NIH. And I said jokingly, as I do with my lawyer friends, and many who started off pre-med become great lawyers. That's the big joke, except it's true. It really is. And the lawyer for NIH came out after us, and she said, I went to the most selective of all, valedictorian, perfect SAT, and you just told my story. And she said, I've always been embarrassed to admit it. If you talk to American audiences and you ask them the question, how many of you know someone who started off in pre-med, engineering, or any of those areas, who changed their major? Everybody raises a hand. They do. And the point I made to NIH is this. We're working to get the American public to be more appreciative of the value of science in our society, to be more supportive of Congress giving more money for stem cell research in other areas. If even the highest achieving Americans in large numbers don't have successful experience in science, why would we expect the average American to be appreciative of the need to support science? And so starting with the idea of wanting our country to invest in science research in STEM areas, whether talking about for healthcare or for energy and environment or for intelligence and defense, it seems to me for the good of the country, we need to think about the culture of teaching and learning in science and engineering. NSF calls the first year of STEM across institutions, 2-year and 4-year institutions, weed out courses. It's just accepted. Now, I've worked with some of the best liberal arts colleges in New England with presidents and deans of science, and I always say to them, you don't expect the majority of your students who start in the first year of science to go to the second year. And they would say, why would you say that, Freeman? I say this, go back and look at the first year, whatever that is for your campus, the first year, the number of seats, and then look at the number of seats in the second year group. There is a big reduction because the assumption is a certain percentage will leave. Now, I want to really commend a faculty member here today. His name is John Cool. He may not be here now, but John had, I said, no campus. I said, here's the question. What's the probability of a student at your institution who begins in science graduating with a bachelor's in science? And this was the first place I came, and I've been to 50 or 60 institutions in the past 2 years, where he could show me a chart where he had actually worked on the data himself to collect it. It was very impressive that he had done that. Then I said, now the next question is, if they graduated in science, did they at least have a B average in the science courses? Because so you can't go to grad school or think about med school if you don't have at least B's in those courses. It's not enough to have a 3.0 overall. Med schools, grad schools will look at research you've done, but they're also going to look at the grades, clearly, and they want at least that B average in those courses, you see. And so he was going to go back and do that, but at least he was looking at that. And the point I'm making with all of that is this, that any campus that is serious, as we had to become, about helping students in general to succeed in science, needs to understand how students are doing by race, by gender, by ethnicity, and by discipline. Because what happens in one discipline, biology, may be different from what happens in mechanical engineering or what happens in computer science. It's a challenge for minorities, it's a challenge for women in a number of areas, but it's a challenge for whites in general. And so across this country, the result is this. Only 6% of the degrees, of the bachelor's degrees in America are in natural sciences and engineering. And this is for 24-year-olds. We're talking about of those with degrees, 6%. In Europe, it's almost 12%. In some of the Asian countries, much higher than that. Computer science is one of the most glaring examples of a challenge we face. According to the National Science Foundation, we have a shortage of about 50,000 bachelor's degrees in computer science per year right now. And the head of computer sciences, computational sciences for NSF says this, the problem of underrepresentation, meaning if you look at women and people of color and people with disabilities, you're talking about 70% of the population. So he said this, the problem of underproductivity of degrees is inextricably linked to the problem of underrepresentation. You can't get there in America unless we find ways of increasing the number of women and people of color in computer science, as an example. And so what we work to do on our campus is to find ways to see how we might improve performance. And here are some of the lessons. Building community among the students makes a big difference. Getting away from the cutthroat attitude that I can't tell you what I know because then your score would be higher than mine. So each of us will say we're doing okay. If you ask any student on your campus or mine at midterm how you're doing in a certain class, whether the student got a D or an A, the student's going to say, I'm okay. Nobody's going to come out saying I bummed out. It's just not the culture of any place I've met. You know, people don't tell strangers or anybody as a rule how they've done. And yet, you know this, if you're in STEM areas, if you earn below a B, especially if you earn below a C, at the midterm point for a calculus course, for a physics course, chemistry course, it's probably over for the semester because one thing builds on another. And so if you've done poorly in the first half, you don't have the foundation to build on for the second half, yet you're just struggling trying to make it. And so the real question becomes, and what we had to work on was how to help students improve in those first year courses. We started by academic support for those students, building community among the students, working to see if we could get them with at least B's in the courses, and number two, getting them immersed in laboratories. I don't think there's anything I can say that's more important than this about the culture of science and teaching and learning. It takes researchers to build researchers. It can't be staff. It has to be the people who are most powerful in the academy, the faculty. It takes researchers, and we wanted faculty who were tenured and who were the very best to be involved. And we were able to get some of them to start looking at these issues of performance and, quite frankly, getting students immersed in the labs. And so our Howard Hughes investigator, Mike Summers, we still have the only Howard Hughes investigator for publics. The medical school just got one. The Maryland Medical School just got one. Hopkins has a number, as you might expect, but this guy, Mike Summers, Howard Hughes investigating biochemistry, has been involved now for almost 20 years in producing these students and helping get other faculty involved in that work. And I bring that up for this reason. We were with small numbers at first. We started with 19 young people, and then every year we had 20, 25. And so people were saying that those numbers wouldn't make a difference in the problem. The problem for minorities, only about 2% of the PhDs in science go to blacks, about 2% to Hispanics. Put the two together, it's not quite 5%. Yet we're talking about that population, Hispanics being the fastest growing. You put Hispanics and blacks together, you're going to be in the next 10 to 15 years about 40% of the population. So the key is how do we get more students in science and engineering? I was saying to Carol, under 1% of the scientists at NIH are black, of the tenure science, under 1%. And you go to any of the institutes and it's about like that. So it's a major problem in American society for competitiveness. And the key is this question of how do we increase those numbers? Well, you start by seeing what works. I also suggested to Dartmouth, to some of your colleagues today, if you were producing 3 blacks a year who went on and got PhDs, you'd be in the top 10 or 15 predominantly white campuses in the country. That's how small the numbers are. We've become the leading predominantly white institution, and we were up through 2006 to about 5 a year. We've now hit a stride. We're up 12 to 15 a year who actually complete PhDs at Harvard and Stanford and the best of places, and MD PhDs. And that's about changing the culture. People often will say, well, minorities are always going to go to med school. Well, it always depends on what they understand. And of course we need more physicians, but we have really emphasized the importance of research and PhDs. And so my Howard Hughes investigator, white guy, wonderful man who's producing all these PhDs in biochemistry and sending other kids on, will speak to a group of families of high-achieving minority students, and he'll give the health disparities points about if you're black or you're Hispanic and you're a woman over 55, your probability of getting this diabetes is 2 to 3 times that of the white population. He goes through those, and then he says this: if your students who are the best prepared among your races, if your children don't take on this battle, who do you expect to do it? It's a powerful argument, it really is. And when people understand that the significance of the research is that PhDs help people they may never see. There's something very noble about that work, and people become amazed at the possibilities. But they need to be exposed, because most have just never known a PhD. They've always thought a real doctor means MD. And we need MDs too, but the idea, and so we become the leading producer of black MD PhDs also. And here's the point. People were concerned about our small numbers at first, but even after 10 years, there was a statistic that shocked the scientific community. It turned out that about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, there were only 67 blacks in the country who earned bachelors in biochemistry. Only 67. 22 came from my campus. And they all went to grad school, and the weakest went just for MD. It's harder to get a PhD. Most people don't realize that in the MD. MD, you're in and you're out. If you're good, you can do it. PhD, you don't know when you're going to graduate. You know, and families are always saying, aren't you finished yet? And you tell them you don't have results, and they're going, They're thinking there's something wrong when it may not be anything wrong. Whether that's in social sciences or inside, you just don't know. But if you're not from that culture, you're thinking, oh, something must be wrong. I had a student here who was one of my miles who's here in med school. I'm trying to, he's saying, I'm going to add that next degree, and I'm excited. There were some students in the back, and they heard him say MBA. I said, no, that's okay. But I thought he was adding on the PhD. Right? Get the MBA, but get the PhD. You're good enough, you can do it. And the point I'm making is a part of changing the culture involves having people understand why it's important to think about grad school. You're not doing it for money. Of course, you're going to make a decent salary, but you're doing it because you can change the world. And it's amazing how establishing that as a value makes a difference. So we're now at over 40% of our undergrads of all races going to grad school, from science and engineering all the way over to the humanities, to classical studies. We've got one of my top kids is now assistant professor of classics at Columbia. So the idea is getting them involved in the research. But for minorities, that group work made the difference. And here's the point. It worked so well for my minority students that my white students said, we want the same thing. And that has really transformed the campus in the past 10 years, because faculty began, not all, just some, began saying, well, suppose we decided to redesign the first year of chemistry. Because what we've found, my students get the 5s on the AP exams, but in certain areas we've said you're better off for the most part if you start with the first course. Just because, I mean, if you know AP Calculus, A, B, and B, C, it's all formulaic. It's very different from what you get. So when you start at that next level, we've done the analytics, which is another theme. It's disaggregating the data. It's using analytics. It's analyzing the trends for different groups. I can tell you that only 20% of my students who get 5s on AP, A, B, and B, C who start with Cal 3 will get an A. I can tell you 40% will get a C or below. And so having students understand, maybe you're better off not starting at that higher level. And in chemistry, it was worse than that. And so what's interesting is that these are kids who have AP 5s on AP exams. Some of the schools in the Washington area are very strong, public schools. You've got kids who would have gotten 5s on AP chemistry in 10th grade, who worked in labs involving NIH since the 10th or 11th grade. Now, they're in that first year chemistry too, so the competition is stiff, but still half the students were flunking the course, Ds and Cs. And so it was wonderful when faculty said, let's see if we can change our attitude about this. And let's figure out what it would take to have a higher percentage doing well. Doing well being defined as at least a B. Because if you're going to major in the discipline, you need to have at least a B usually. And we redesigned chemistry. If you look on the webpage at the Chemistry Discovery Center, you will get a feel for what we do. We work in groups. We assign them randomly. We don't give them the theories. They have to really struggle to determine the theories. We use problems out of some of the biotech companies on campus. A part of our innovation effort is involved over the past 20 years, encouraging faculty to work with agencies to start companies. And so we have 85 companies, biotech and IT companies on campus. Some focus on intelligence and cybersecurity, others in biotech, but we've used a lot of the problems from those companies as students begin working in internships. But the key is that students can't be laid back and just take notes. They are involved as a project manager, they're a blogger, they've got roles that they play, and they are using the technology. They have to collaborate. We use the Blackboard system not simply for course management, but in helping them to talk constantly when they're not in class. And the result has been a 50% increase in students who are earning at least a B. Since the early 2000s, we've gone, I looked at it today, we've gone from about 350 majors in biochemistry and chemistry to 650, with the enrollment not changing that much. Because, and we can now say to our legislature, every time a student doesn't retake a course, we save $1,700, quite frankly. And we had large numbers retaking courses regularly. So that led to, now, the first thing some of my colleagues said was, well, that's because it must be an easier course. So we had ACS, American Chemical, come in and evaluate. It's actually more rigorous than the other type. So that once you show the analysis that the rigor is there and it's a different way, more people become involved and say, let's look at the next level. So they're now looking at the second level of chemistry, but we've now done the same thing in other areas. And the innovation has to do with people saying, how might we do it differently? So if you know the Nexus project from Howard Hughes right now, this next experiment in undergrad science, we are doing it, we are infusing mathematics into biology. Purdue, I think, is integrating biology and chemistry. Miami is looking at the life of physics. There are 5 institutions creating modules that we can all use, and these faculty from biology and chemistry and physics are looking at ways of integrating the work. One campus is doing case studies, and this is all based on the 2009 report on the future of medicine. And so, again, the idea of using reports, working with other campuses to rethink coursework. The same thing we're doing with Gates, with the Kauffman Foundation, for us leveraging resources. And what this theory of change that we talk about in one of my articles is about, has to do with leveraging resources, having a vision of self. For us, it's about a place where students can come with the highest possible standards, where it really is a tough place but a caring place, where excellence is what we're expecting, the highest possible standards, and partnering with other institutions. So we have an engineering research center with Princeton, with students going back and forth. We do a lot with Hopkins, as you might expect. We just redid our first-year statistics course for non-math majors with Carnegie Mellon's program, with the Ithaca study, and we're able to show the effectiveness of it. So blended instruction, use of technology, collaboration, groups. And it's worked so well in STEM, we've now moved it to the other disciplines. So we have Linehan Artist Scholars, Drescher Humanities Scholars, Sondheim Public Affairs Scholars, and then other communities within, because we found that building community among those students can help them connect in a way intellectually that leads to their thinking about the person they want to be. It worked so well with students that we use that same notion of community in the advanced project, the advanced to increase the number of women faculty in science. Some of you know that NSF has given out some of these grants, and we applied for one, and I told the campus I wanted to be the PI. I wanted to make the point that the paucity of women in selected STEM areas is an American issue, not just an issue for women, but for all of us. Just as the issue of minorities, my faculty are primarily white and Asian. They are not minority. We're working to get a presence of a black, for example, in every department, a Hispanic, and we're still working on Hispanic. But the key is that we've gone since the early part of the first decade, 2003-04, from 12% faculty, women in science and engineering. Now, I should tell you, the men on campus, including me, we all said, we don't have a problem with women. We've got plenty of women over in the departments. Well, they were wonderful technicians and lecturers. They were not tenured or tenure-track faculty. And that was the point women were making, that the culture was such, we just accepted the idea that most of the full professors were men. And it wasn't that anybody was a bad person, it was just, it is as it is. And that's where innovation comes in. The question is, does it have to be that way? And that was what the advanced program allowed us to do. But we used what we learned with minority students to work on this issue of women faculty and to work on the paucity of women in computer science. Computer science, of all the disciplines in STEM, for women and people of color, all groups have gone down in recent years, over the past 5 years in computer science, but women are down for research universities to about 12%. And for the country, only 20% of the majors. And so we now have a center for women in IT. It's called CWIT. And again, the idea is how do you build the excitement for that and give them a community to help support each other, since there are only 3 or 4 per class. And it is amazing how, whether it's the women faculty, we've gone from 12% to 39% at this point, with 51% of our assistant professors being women. And that was about changing policies, rethinking the structure, and rethinking our attitudes. I don't think anything was more significant than when we had the University of Michigan players in. They do this role playing. They listen to the conversations in departmental meetings, and then they take on the roles of different people. It was so embarrassing. It really was, in a good way though. And what we saw was it was true. When the woman says something, so often people go, but nothing changes. The guy says the same thing, and, oh, it's a great idea, and all of a sudden you change things. It was without people realizing it, just attitudes. It was this and these are all good people. Don't miss my point. These are all people who care about each other. Or when the woman is saying something and the guy over just kind of starts talking and interrupts. And so when the players did it, people were saying, I don't do that. Yeah, you do. You know, and it was wonderful to have us looking in the mirror at ourselves. Now, the good thing about me was I interrupt everybody, so I wasn't discriminating against men or women. I'm always, they said, Freeman, you just need to shut up and let other people talk, right? But the point I'm making is that for faculty and for students, innovation has meant looking at how we analyze the problem using the data rather than using anecdotal information. Too often we make decisions and draw conclusions in higher education based on anecdotes. The best students go to the best grad schools. You know, final example, the PhD completion project with the Council of Grad Schools. I was working with some of our colleagues in a couple of the engineering departments, and we were talking about having this project, and they said, we don't have a problem with this. Everybody we know graduates. I said, no, 50% of the students who start in engineering don't graduate. And they said, no, it couldn't be. The guy got up, he was very impassioned, and wonderful faculty. He said, listen, Freeman, every student I know graduates. And I said, yeah, that's the problem. Half the students you just don't know. They slip through the cracks. You get my point? So unless you get the data, you just don't make the progress. You know, I want to close with this idea. Aristotle once said that excellence is never an accident. Excellence is never an accident. It is the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents making the right choice. It represents choosing from a variety of options. And he finally says this, choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Choice, not chance, determines your destiny. And there's our question. Dartmouth, what is it that you choose? Thank you all very much.